One of the things I want to make a comment about is I think what Ingrid is doing so beautifully for us is demonstrating, and this is where we're going to kind of move to for the rest of the afternoon, not just the fact that we can identify things like, oh, there's a lot of anxiety, or oh, there's a lot of stress, but what can we do about it? How can we move to actually doing something about what we know is there? And so this is going to be sort of a very different talk, but I've been talking about this for a while, and the question is, I thought it was a slightly clever title. Are we there yet? I've talked for a while now about what we've learned in terms of the neurocognitive impairments in kids with 22q, also kids with Fragile X syndrome, and a whole bunch of other disorders that have a similarity. And I've talked about the fact that we wanted to build an intervention for this limitation. And I'm going to quickly tell you that we've made some progress at long last. And I'm excited to tell you about that and where we're going to go with it. So the bottom line of this whole thing is we want to create a truly evidence-based, Robbie mentioned that, digital, I call this a digital neurotherapeutic. It's basically like the digital version of a pharmacological drug that's indicated for several disorder populations, one of them being 22q. We really want to be able to deliver a scientifically validated and market-ready intervention. You see this is kind of, actually this is my talk that I try to show investors, or bits of it, because they really want to see where we are. And the value of this is it's going to be a real health, not a consumer entertainment thing. We're not trying to build a toy here or a game. It looks like a game, but it's actually supposed to be a health product that's backed by expert clinicians, scientists, labs, and data. So what is the problem that we're trying to solve? If you've seen any of the things we've done over here in the last 15 years, we know that some brains, and it's quite common in kids with 22q, incompletely represent spatial and temporal information. So this is actually characteristic of several disorders. I'm going to use NDDs for neurodevelopmental disorders shorthand, and 22q is one of them, but these other ones too. And it's actually often reported as something that's called non-verbal learning disorder that no one really knows what it is, but this is a characteristic of people who get labeled with that. So and I'm actually going to skip over this one, although Stu mentioned that it actually is something that we see as a consequence of congenital heart defect. So what we developed here, and we code-named this, because you've got to have a code name for stuff. First of all, it's a secret project. No, not really, but you've got to actually have something, a product, and you've got to have a name. So right now we're calling it Fastbrain. It's not a terribly good name, but it's this notion of a digital drug, and the idea is that it came about from a convergence of two evidence bases. So those evidence bases are the fact that we have spatial and temporal resolution difficulties in nonverbal learning disorders. And what I mean by that is I've used this analogy for a long time, like the ability to represent information in the minds and brain of kids with these disorders is like having a lower resolution digital camera. So you get a blurrier image when you try to get into detail, and you can't tell the difference between things that are somewhat similar to one another. That's a large evidence base we've gathered over the years. And there's another evidence base out there that playing action video games, first-person shooter action video games, are things you really don't want your kids to do, although maybe that's even happening in the room here. They actually do seem to have some positive cognitive impacts, strangely enough. And those impacts are precisely the ones that seem to be the ones that are limited here. So putting these two things together led us to the notion of this, but the question is, what is it targeted at? It's targeted at specific neurocognitive functions, and our goal is to say we have to build some specific algorithms that sort of take out that active compound. In other words, if this is like a drug that's changing the brain, how is it changing it in a positive way? And how can we separate that out and make something that can effectively dose that impact to those brains that could be improved. So I like to do things experientially. Many of you have seen this. It still won't change if you've seen it anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, right here is going to be a cross. So people on the edges of the screen, of the room, you might be able to cheat on this, but fix your eyes on this cross and don't move them, okay? Do me a favor. And then I want you to yell out, how many bars do you see on the other side? Look at this cross. How many bars do you see? 5. Everybody see? 5? You're a smart crowd. Most people actually report seeing 4. Probably the people who said 5 are out there on the edges because you're at a different angle. Okay, so the problem is this is quite hard to do, and I won't go into why it's hard to do, but the point is that the brain actually incompletely represents this spatial information for reasons that take some explanation. But it's almost as if you have a 4 megapixel versus a 16 megapixel camera, that they get blurry from one another, and you get this effect called crowding. And so I'm going to skip over this, although we know a lot of these issues, because I want to quickly just show you some of the evidence. So when we know this because when we get kids to do a task like this, so here's the task. I'll explain this real quickly. There's a bunch of circles that you see on screen in these kind of rings, and there's in the middle there's a focus point, and then a target will show up, and then they all get covered up, and you have to indicate where you saw that target. And they can either be near the center of the screen or increasingly spread out. It's actually what we call degrees of visual angle: 10 degrees out, 20 degrees out, 30 degrees out. Okay, and what you can see is that typically developing kids, 7 to 14 years of age, who are in blue, show this effect where they're very good, very high accuracy at 10 degrees and 20 degrees from the middle. That's the first and the second row circle. But when you get to 30 degrees, their accuracy drops off. You see exactly the same effect in kids who have 22q, but they're less able to do this overall. So we need a boost in that ability. Okay. Another piece of evidence is this one. Which of these two bars is the bigger, the first one or the second one, the blue ones? Okay, the first one's very easy because the first blue bar is twice the length of the other one, but the second one is rather harder, not impossible. And what we find is when we compare the ability to do that, the ratio between the two at which people can operate with 75% accuracy, the typical kids can do it when the second one is only about 95% the size of the first one, whereas kids with 22q need to be about 80-some%, and more of them need an even bigger difference between the two. So in fact, we joke around my lab that 15 years of research can be reduced to the front of a t-shirt that says the difference has to be bigger before you notice the difference. And that could be our entire data right there. And so you see that in space, and you see that in time. Okay, so there's an even bigger difference in time. So, I'm just going through this quickly, and this is another example. I want you to tell me which of these 4 guys is flashing out of sequence with all the other ones. One on the top left, right? And then here's another one. The one on the bottom right. And in fact, when you do that, the faster they flash, the harder it is. Okay? And so you can see that if you are typically developing, you're very accurate when it flashes 2 times a second, much less when it flashes 10 times a second. Children who have extra X chromosomes look rather like typically developing kids. You get the same function in kids with 22q, but their accuracy is about 30% lower. So we want to boost that up as well. Okay? So the solution is, our thought is that the solution is to take this active compound from video game playing and to try to make a video game that actually changes that. And I want to show you momentarily a little bit of evidence of what happens if you get video game players who play lots and lots of those action video games and those who don't. And this is that same task I showed you with the concentric circles, okay? And this is a paper that was on the front of Nature magazine, Nature Science magazine in 2003. And this is video game players. Their accuracy at 10 and 20 and 30 degrees is 90, nearly 100, and 90-some degrees, 90-some%. And this is people who don't play video games. That looks awfully like those data, right? So the question is, what happens if you take those video game players and you improve their ability by playing video games? And in fact, what you get is a real increase where you can move these people towards that difference by playing action video games, but not Tetris, which is still a spatial game. Okay? So why? And if you do this with time, this is a complicated task. I haven't got time to explain it. But basically, this is how the resolution, you can see something before it gets overwhelmed by something that came right after it. Okay, this is accuracy. It's high. It drops. It comes back up as you get a bigger and bigger gap between the two items, and that's video game players, non-video game players. Okay, so there's a big gap there. So, very quickly, why not just take medications? Well, medications essentially fill up your whole brain. They are not targeted to specific neurocognitive circuits. Okay, so they really can't target a drug to a specific neurocognitive circuit, and we also know that you can't do this. That's not going to work terribly well, and it turns out that this doesn't work very well either. Even though all over the internet people are telling you can do brain training, there really is no such thing as brain training per se. So I'm going to skip over this point too because I'm going to go quickly. But here's an important point. Why not off-the-shelf games? And the reason is that not off-the-shelf games. I just told you that a whole bunch of first-person action video games are really good at having that effect of improving spatial and temporal abilities. By the way, there are studies that show it isn't just people who have very good spatial and temporal abilities that play these games, because you can take people who don't play them and you can improve it. So they do have that active effect. But why not just off-the-shelf games? Because off-the-shelf games are like taking essentially a bit like a vitamin. They deal with lots of things. They change lots of factors when you're playing, and they're targeted lots of factors. So they don't only change their adaptive abilities based on one thing. There's lots of factors. So you're getting trained on a lot of different areas at one time. All right, here's a little bit of video from the prototype that we have. So what you're actually seeing here is it's a third-person view just at the moment. We partnered with a video game company, and we have actually implemented a little bit of this, and this is actually me playing, and what you'll see in a moment is an overlay. And so what you're actually seeing here is an adaptive algorithm that is changing the likelihood of where one of these targets will appear, both how quickly, which is what we call the rate of view, and how spatially wide, depending on my performance, and it's going to change adaptively with what I'm doing, both up and both down. Okay? So I'm going to skip on from there just to show you, and I just want to show you one thing and then I will quit. Okay? So does this work? All right? Does it work? We took a 20-some-year-old adult male, by definition a video game player, who's actually one of my research assistants, and we had him play the game. All right? So what you can see here is minutes of play and the reaction of the game to how difficult it makes it for space and for time. And basically what this is showing is that within the first couple of minutes, he basically hits absolute maximum difficulty for what we can implement currently at the moment. So it's sensitive to his abilities, which are very, very good. And so you can see that when it gets really, really fast, he gets a bit panicked and drops off slightly. But this is an expert player, and you can see that the game adapts very quickly. We had a 7-year-old, almost 7-year-old with 22Q play this game, and this is what his performance looked like on his first game, his second game, and his third game. So you see that he does much more poorly, and we've sort of hyper-accelerated this, but he's getting better, and he actually manages to hold on to that ability for a little while, although he doesn't play for very long. But for time, and I showed you time was worse, he's having a harder time getting benefit from that. Okay? So that really shows you we've made some progress. We have a possibility that we can actually do something with this. And what's next is we're doing essentially an unfunded efficacy trial. We're going to contact a few people who live nearby to maybe ask you if you'd like to bring your child in for pre-testing, play this a few times, and then come back for testing. We can only handle like 2 or 3 kids at once. We have literally no money to do this. We've got a couple of these things. There's going to be a waiting list, I'm sure. We'll be looking out for you, but leave your name if you're interested, and we'll try to work through the list. So now we move on. So we want to tell you now, I'm going to do a two-hander. Myself and Abby Popa is going to come up after me. Abby's my great graduate student in the neuroscience graduate group at the moment. And I'm going to tell you about our brand new study. This has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. It took us a number of years to get this. This is the result of that transformation I talked about this morning. We have completely changed our direction in the lab. And so everything you've been hearing this morning and all the way through the afternoon is this notion that we can think about cognitive and affective factors interacting to both produce risk and also protection against the psychotic symptoms, not schizophrenia itself, but those weaker symptoms that show up much earlier. And so we call this CARP, and here's our little logo that we like to use. So what we're saying is that cognitive impairments limit competence in numerous domains, like those spatial and temporal ones I just showed you. They vary a lot, and I talked earlier about this notion that we have copers and strugglers that we've seen. Kids who have high adaptive functioning and low anxiety are the ones that we think of as our copers, and other kids with 22Q have high anxiety and low adaptive functioning, and they're struggling a whole lot more. And so our question is, we don't have a formal definition of you're a coper and you're a struggler, but we can characterize these people. If you saw my talk this morning with those different groups, you can see that they fall apart fairly clearly. So the question is, if you're struggling over a long period of time, does that increase your risk? If you're not, does that reduce your risk? It's not to account for all of your risk. And then, since we know that we can work with you to make strugglers struggle less, can we change this? And here's quickly how we like to think of it. You have this familiar U-shaped curve, inverted U-shaped curve. This can be stress, it can be stimulation, it can be information. When nothing is going on, you don't do anything in response. There's no behavior when there's no stimulation. But the more interested you become, the more stimulated you become, and slightly more stressful you become, the more action you get involved in, you get more interested, you have more opportunities to learn. And then there's this magic part where what you're able to do completely matches what you're being asked to do. You're firing all cylinders, you feel great. And then suddenly the phone rings and your boss says, you were supposed to deliver that report from me yesterday. You go, I'll get it. And yet that fight or flight mechanism starts, and you're supposed to feel that, okay? And then you handle it and you go, oh, that was okay. But now you're handling that, and the school nurse calls and says, your kid is in the school nurse office, you've got to come get them. And you just want to freak out at that point, right? So now your performance really, really goes down. And that's appropriate too. But only momentarily. If you keep doing this and you keep doing this and keep doing this, the appearance of those activities will start to make you anxious. You won't want to go there. And if you're forced to go there, you may just actually lose it completely and melt down. All right? So you can get fear and hyperarousal and the fight or flight mechanism. That's natural, that's adaptive. But you can end up with emotional dysregulation and this notion we call allostatic load, which I don't have time to explain. But basically what it says is like you're carrying a huge extra load trying to manage this difficulty over a long period of time. Kathy showed this earlier, and I showed this earlier. Typically developing kids here in pink, they're usually the other way around, have higher adaptive functioning, everyday real-world problem solving when their IQ is higher and less when their IQ is lower. We do not find that relationship in kids with 22q. Those with high IQ, those with low IQ, there's no effect on adaptive functioning. What we do see is that the amount of anxiety, if it's high, is correlated with low adaptive functioning, and if it's low, it's correlated with higher adaptive functioning, okay? So I just showed you this, and if you're struggling with these difficulties and you're having these same problems, then you're actually having a harder time working your way through the world. And so what we are thinking is that the more impairment you have, if it's not well matched to the demands, your behavior can sort of fall apart on you. And so the more stressed and anxious you become, the harder it is to deploy your cognitive resources. So we've got a lot of evidence that certain areas of cognitive function, which are related to these symptoms of psychosis, not getting schizophrenia itself, but those weaker symptoms that you see over time that suggest you might be at slightly higher risk and can be intervened upon and it happened earlier, some of the pieces of those things show up early. So here's our famous whack-a-mole task. You see this mole showing up. You have to press a button to whack it every time it shows up. You don't press the button when there's a vegetable. And what we found over the years, there's a lot of data here, but basically what this shows you primarily is that typically developing kids get better and better at this the more of these no-goes that happen before, more of these go trials happen before you actually have to withhold a response, but that doesn't make any impact on the kids who have 22q. And the most important thing that we find here is if you look at the effect of age on that performance, you've got plenty of kids with 22q who are the dark dots doing very, very well, just as well as typically developing kids. But there's a group down here in the 11, 12, 13, 14 range, right where you might see those symptoms showing up, who are very poor at this. Okay, and this is a factor that can be not necessarily a symptom. It doesn't predict anything, but it might be a factor that's showing you're having a hard time. And Abby's going to talk more about this in a moment. Similarly, I talked earlier, we know that having a lot of anxiety disorders, which can interfere with your cognitive functioning, and there's a bidirectional effect. Being anxious makes you harder to function, and having a hard time functioning makes you more anxious. As we've said, those people who had a longer history of anxiety, when studied over time, tended to be more represented in the group that got psychosis or increased symptoms. Again, I'll state very clearly, having an anxiety disorder does not mean you will generate psychotic symptoms or become psychotic, but it's going to increase your risk in some sense. Okay, so this led to this whole new research direction of ours, and this entire picture was generated by being transformed by the Mind Institute culture, by interacting with you as families, telling us what the issues were, and interacting ourselves as a clinical team and a research team, and talking to one another, and talking about you guys. We really did talk about you guys a lot after you left, but what had we learned about your kids? What had we learned about your environment? What had we learned about the situation? And how would that pose new research questions to us? So we asked this question simply, does this difficulty of anxiety adaptive functioning modulate psychosis risk? So can it protect you if you're doing better and actually increase the risk if you're doing less well? We have this brand new grant that started about a month ago. We're going to be very active in recruiting 12 to 18-year-olds. We need 100 12 to 18-year-olds to come twice in a 2.5-year period. 50 typically developing kids. We have a lot of executive function tasks which have hot and cold versions, and Abby will explain this in a moment. The cold version is the one I showed you. There's no information that's effective or affective, emotional, and some that is. ERPs, which is brain signal, she's going to show you that. We have some MRI measures to look at some specific networks, and a clinical interview to assess how many of those symptoms you're showing, not whether you're on your way to psychosis or not on your way to psychosis, how much of that symptomology you're actually showing. We have a big team here of experts in a range of different areas, and it's really this huge team of people over the years that contributed to this, and especially the clinicians here and some of our funding. And just, the Dempster Foundation helped us enormously in some of this too.